Hello, good afternoon. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Thursday, April 9th, 2026. The time is 12:50 p.m., and I'm in Miami-Dade County, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection Part XIII, The Wild Wild Corner. And I'll have you know, ladies and gentlemen, as I usually do, that this and many of my other lectures are recorded outdoors, as it is a preference of mine. So I may have to raise or project my voice from time to time in order to drown out the background noise. Please adjust your volumes accordingly, and thank you for tuning in. This video is going to be part 13 of the Cuba Terrorism and Gangstalking lecture series. And I believe that it is important for me as your host to let you know why this is an important subject to me. And the reason it's an important subject to me is because as having lived in Miami-Dade County for almost 9 years now, I've been very exposed to Cuban history, culture, and language. And I think it's important for any American to familiarize themselves with the very demographics of people that reside in your city, state, or county. This is important and essential if you are going to have a better understanding of the world around you, indeed a better grasp of the social elements that are around you on a daily basis. When I started doing history research and cultural research into the Cuban diaspora, particularly throughout the United States, starting with Miami, Florida, I noticed an interesting backstory there. I noticed that the trajectory of the Cuban people from Cuba to the United States, the political trajectory of that diaspora over the past 60 years, it's left a trail that I think has eminent political significance. When you talk about the path from Cuba to Miami over the past 60 years, okay, you're going to see a number of things. One of the things that you're going to notice is that one day Fidel Castro walked over to the beach in Havana, Cuba, and he looked at the wild blue ocean, and he raised his hand in the air, and he made a promise to himself, Fidel Castro. He made a promise to himself, and he said, one day I'm going to turn the United States of America into a cocaine utopia. I'm going to turn the United States of America into a cocaine paradise. I'm going to turn the United States of America into a cocaine wonderland. I'm going to turn the United States of America into a cocaine oasis. And I'm going to do so with the help of my friends in Central America, South America, and in the Eastern lands. And that's exactly what he did, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot run from the past. You must confront the past in order to forge a better future. Now you might say, well, how did that affect the diaspora? Well, here's how. You had the Mariel boat lifts. That was stage one. Fidel Castro said in the 1980s in particular, I'm going to dump all my felons out of prison. And I'm going to put them on boats and send them to America. Because we don't want them here in Cuba anymore. We Cubans are ready to usher in a new Cuban century, a new Cuban millennium. This is going to be a new proud day for the Cuban people. And the first thing we're going to do to usher in that new generation of Cuban greatness is I'm going to dump all my prisons out. I'm going to empty them. And I'm going to ship all the felons to Miami to get them out of here. And so the Miamians can deal with it. But little did the people of Cuba know, little did the U.S. of A know, little did anyone know, what was really being done was narco-terrorists and potential narco-terrorists were being dumped into Miami so that when the drug trade started and Cuba started shipping cocaine, heroin, quaaludes, and marijuana that was funneled to them from Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Colombia, they would be able to take that packaged product, ship it to the States by the ton. Okay, we're talking 20 to 30 tons a shipment of some dope. And it was going all the way to Miami, it was going to the Florida Keys, and there were already narco-terrorists waiting for those shipments. The narco-terrorists were already in place. They were already in position because they'd already been sent there on the Mariel boat list from Fidel's prisons. So the Cuban people thought, well, we're getting rid of the worst of Cuban society. The Americans thought, well, we're being compassionate and Christian Americans by bringing in these impoverished Cubans from overseas. All the while Fidel Castro was sitting in his office, rubbing his hands together and saying, it has begun. The next cocaine explosion that is to happen in the free world will be done by my hand. We, the Cuban people, we will benefit. I will benefit. My elected officers, my elected officials in government, they will benefit. The Cuban people will benefit from here and forever because of the tens of billions of dollars of cocaine money we're about to bring in U.S. dollars. And that's exactly what happened too, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some things to talk about today. As a Miamian, as a person who lives (113.5 miles from Cuba, I believe I have a right as a United States citizen to know what's going on there and how it affects me, how it affects my progeny, how it affects my significant others, and to what degree I can take my own personal safety into my own hands as a Miamian living in Miami. Ladies and gentlemen, from time to time, when you're talking about historical matters, like the Cuban diaspora, like the Cuban narcotics trade, like the international narco-terrorism trade, like clandestine gang stalk, it's beneficial and indeed necessary to talk about the backstory of these events so that they make sense to you, the listener, to me, the host, and to all other parties involved. These things have to make sense if we are to benefit from the lessons that they present to us. Cuba is a beautiful country. Beautiful beaches, lush greenery, tropical lagoons. It's gorgeous. The United States, also a beautiful country. You have hundreds of thousands of acres of rolling land across states A, B, and C. You have millions upon millions of square footage of terrain and rolling hills and valleys, and you have your forests and your canyons and vast wooded areas, beautiful lakes and streams. You have your gorgeous coastal areas like Miami-Dade County, beautiful country. China, beautiful country, gorgeous country. Rolling land, rolling landscapes, beautiful tundras, amazing wildlife. In the southern China area, you have a tropical climate that's gorgeous and rivals some of the most beautiful tropical areas anywhere in the world. Russia, beautiful country, gorgeous country. Wonderful terrain. Beautiful terrestrial valleys. Amazing swaths of rolling land all throughout the country. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. All countries gorgeous. Ladies and gentlemen, it's beneficial to understand that within any country, regardless of how beautiful its geography is or its geographic features is, it's important to understand the historical significance of the things, of the events, of the decisions made that impact those very countries in the long term. What is the socio-political makeup of the U.S.? What's the socio-political makeup of Cuba? What's the socio-political makeup of China? What's the socio-political makeup of Russia? And why are these countries important in the grand scheme of things? There's an answer to all these questions. But we must understand that there are political ideologies in this world that conflict with one another. Yeah, China and the US, they have lots of people that tour. There are lots of visitors and migrants and so forth that tour the US from China and that tour China from the US. And the same with Russia and Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, so many countries that have political ideologies that are so different from one another, yet they have such a interest in one another at the same time. Maybe that interest is fascination. Maybe some of that interest is political in nature. Maybe some of that interest is about being cautious, knowing who is across that ocean, who is across that sea. What kind of country is it that exists beyond our borders? What kind of countries are there? What kind of people, what kind of culture, what kind of governments are there? You see, there's that curiosity, there's that socio-political curiosity that capitalist and communist countries have always had with one another that makes their relationship fascinating, even if those relationships are adversarial in nature. So, there's a lot to cover here today, ladies and gentlemen. The first item that we're going to read from today is going to be a written statement by the President of the United States, Mr. Donald John Trump. He wrote a statement in January of 2026, this year, on his concerns with the Cuban state. And it's an open letter. It's posted on whitehouse.gov. We're going to read it. We're going to examine it. It's important to understand the Cuba situation from a Republican president's perspective. Okay? Really, since the 1960s, there's been a bit of a divide on Cuba between Republicans and Democrats, okay? And especially since the Ronald Reagan 1980s, okay? It's sort of been the party line since the 1980s for Republicans to be skeptical of Cuba as a country of interest, and not only skeptical but cautious. The Democrats, on the other hand, see Cuba as a potential strategic asset because, for one, Cuba, has embraced the communist ideology as set forth by Joseph Stalin and the communists and the Soviet Russians. And when the Soviets conquered Cuba in the 1960s and gave her communism, that was going to be the start between no one knew it at the time, but that was going to be the start of Cuba's relationship with the Democrat Party here in the United States, because keep in mind, the Democrats have more of a tendency to be friendly with countries that share their political ideology, which is more, it swings more towards socialism or communism than the Republicans' political ideology, which focuses more on nationalism and right-wing values or conservative values. Okay, so Democrats are less likely to hold Cuba in contempt for its perceived narco-terrorist actions. And part of that reason is because there's an affinity between the Democrat Party and a lot of different political parties around the world that are left-wing. Okay, we're not here to say that the Democrats adhere to socialism or communism, but they are left-wing. They're a left-wing political party. And socialism and communism are left-wing political values. And I believe that countries who have embraced left-wing political values, namely socialist and communist countries, are countries that the Democrat Party here in the United States are more inclined to favor and less inclined to designate as problematic or dangerous to United States interests. Okay? Republicans, on the other hand, they are very skeptical of communist countries, very skeptical of socialism, and they are more inclined to vilify those types of countries. So it's no surprise, ladies and gentlemen, that this letter that I'm going to read from, that is written by President Trump, is critical and skeptical of Cuba. Okay, right-wing Republicans, okay, are skeptical of Cuba. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a registered Republican, and I'm skeptical of Cuba, but it's for no reason other than my own research. I'm not taking cues from anybody. I'm not taking directives from anybody. I'm not being told what to say or think. This is based on my own research. And not just over the past 5 or 10 years, I'm talking about for the last 50 years of research. And some things that I've experienced personally in Miami-Dade County. It makes me skeptical of what's happening in the Cuban state. Is it in the interests of the United States to take a hands-off approach to Cuba? I don't think so personally, given my own research and experiences. President Trump has a similar mindset, and we're going to read from a letter that President Trump posted on whitehouse.gov in January of this year. We're going to read this letter, and we're going to examine some of the talking points. Okay, so the letter begins, "By the authority vested in me as President of the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, I hereby determine and order, Section 1, National Emergency. As President of the United States, I have an imperative duty to protect the national security and foreign policy of this country. I find that the policies, practices, and actions of the government of Cuba constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside of the United States to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. The government of Cuba has taken extraordinary actions that harm and threaten the United States. The regime aligns itself with and supports for numerous hostile countries, transnational terrorist groups, and malignant actors adverse to the United States, including the government of the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, the government of Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. For example, Cuba blatantly hosts adversaries of the United States. Inviting them to sophisticated military and intelligence capabilities in Cuba that directly threaten. I'm sorry, let me reread that. The words were kind of running off the page. It says, for example, Cuba blatantly hosts dangerous adversaries of the United States, inviting them to base sophisticated military and intelligence capabilities in Cuba that directly threaten the national security of the United States. I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. So we see here in this first paragraph, or these first couple of paragraphs, Trump is asserting that a primary reason for his skepticism of Cuba is its progressive working relationship with countries that President Trump sees as a threat to national sovereignty and security. Now, I'm going to disagree with President Trump on China and Russia and North Korea and Iran, and here's why. Okay, and I know we just had something happen in Iran that was very cataclysmic to the Iranian government. The Shah of Iran was killed in a military strike by Israel, and the successor may have also been seriously wounded in that strike. I'm not here to blame Israel for doing what it thinks it needs to do to secure its homeland, but I'm also not about to sit here and blame Iran for expressing discontentment with how its adversaries in the West handle retaliation campaigns. Okay? I've never been to the Middle East. I frequently observe Middle Eastern news on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and all kinds of news channels across the internet. So I am fully aware of the 75 to 80 year history between the Muslim world and Israel in that same time frame. I know it's volatile. I know it's dramatic. I know it's militarily explosive over there. But we have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, unless you live in that part of the world, unless you've experienced that kind of political sequencing for yourself, it is going to be very difficult to sit here and make a character judgment on either Israel or Iran. Okay? October 7th, 2024, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? Some militants that were apparently linked to, in some respects linked to Hamas, carried out a massacre of at least 1,500 Israelis in the streets of Tel Aviv, if I'm not mistaken. That was seen as an act of war by the Israeli government, so that's how they treated it. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, people look at that from the outside, for example, South Africa, and says, those are not retaliations, those are genocidal crimes against humanity that Israel's doing. And then Israel comes back weeks later and speaks to that same United Nations and says, you know, these are the numbers of rocket attacks we experience. These are the numbers of massacres we experience. These are the numbers of kidnappings we experience. These are the numbers of atrocities that we experience at the hand of our enemy. What we're doing is a national security measure. It's a national security protocol. It's something we're doing in the interest of Israeli national security. And we are going to take this out. We are going to take out any and all threats we can from now on. Okay? That's Israel's mentality. Okay? Who is to say Israel is right or wrong if you do not live there? Okay? Quite frankly, there's nothing you can do about it. Nuclear weapons are here to stay. Every country on planet Earth should have them in case of a national emergency. Every country on planet Earth should have access to a nuclear arsenal. That way, there's checks and balances. No country is going to invade another country that it knows has a nuclear arsenal. No country is going to be invaded by another country if you yourself have a nuclear arsenal. All countries should have a nuclear arsenal so that they can prepare to defend themselves in case of a national emergency. So I don't have a problem with Iran or anyone doing that. What I have a problem with is this. I don't think any country should develop nuclear weapons and then threaten another country with those weapons. Now, that is something that I have heard in the American news of Iran doing as they're enriching uranium and producing nuclear weapons underground. They're saying, well, we're preparing to wipe Israel off the map. Okay, that's not smart in my opinion. That's bad military leadership to say such a thing. It's one thing to produce these weapons. It's another thing to produce these weapons and say you're going to use them on somebody. That I disagree with. Okay, as much as I admire the historicity and the philosophical consequences that the old empires of the Bible showed us, okay, the kingdoms of Israel, the kingdoms of Babylonia, the kingdoms of the ancient Persians, the kingdoms of the ancient Greeks, the kingdoms of the ancient Romans. As much as these cultures fascinate me, never will I allow my fascination with a country, its past, present, or future, allow it to cloud my judgment on political matters that involve that country. I think the Persian Empire was an amazing thing. But thousands of years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, I would like to see the governments of that empire, of the modern day Persian Empire, make better political decisions. Protect yourself. Be diplomatic. Have a sit down with Israel. Have a sit down with the United States. Have a sit down with Cuba and Russia and England and France and Germany and talk it out so that there is peace and stability and commerce and understanding and all of these wonderful things that politics can bring. But you're going to notice, ladies and gentlemen, that in this particular piece, President Trump is going to be highly critical of communist countries, and my mentality is, you know, a lot of this is the party line. Okay, I'm not too much of a fan of involving Cuba's relationship with Russia and China. Russia and China helped develop Cuba in the 1960s. Okay, when Cuba was on the rocks, And there was so much political stability there, and there was all this infighting and these civil wars. Okay, American interests, like for example, the CIA had set up a puppet regime there, and that puppet regime was basically charged with annihilating any rival political parties that stood up. Okay, that was the reality in Cuba for a while, and after a while, the CIA was they were kind of moved out of there by the Soviets and the Chinese, and possibly with a little North Korean help, so that these countries could grasp Cuba, lift her out of the dirt. Because mind you, again, ladies and gentlemen, Cuba was run into the ground by civil wars and infighting. And Soviet Russia, Soviet China, and North Korea wanted to stabilize Cuba and give her a second chance at a progressive and prosperous civilization. Okay, in the wake of all of the civil wars and civil conflicts that Cuba experienced. Okay, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Soviet Russia, Soviet China, and North Korea had a strategic interest, developed a strategic interest, not only in Cuba, but in the entire Spanish-speaking world. So Cuba was step one. Okay? So you cannot divorce Cuba from China, Russia, or North Korea, period. They have a long history of what you might call international diplomacy, and there's a very deep-rooted history between those three countries. Okay, so there's competition between the U.S., China, and Russia. I understand that. There's always been competition between the U.S., China, and Russia, and the reason there's competition between the U.S., China, and Russia is because, in many respects and by many people's estimation, these countries are the most competitive countries in the world economically and militarily. So of course, they're the three biggest and they're the three best at everything that you could imagine. Technology included. The United States, Russia, and China collectively or individually have more satellites in space and have more space technology than any of the other countries too. Okay, so yeah, they're the three big guys on the stage. Yeah, there's going to be some competition. I don't have a problem with competition. Competition can actually help you become better at something. Competition in schools makes students pursue better grades. Competition in the workplace makes workers more productive. Competition in the business markets make companies more effective and efficient. Competition between countries make countries pursue excellence to a higher degree than if there were no competition. So I'm here to praise competition. There's nothing wrong with competition. It's natural and it's human to be competitive in anything. But what we see happening here is we see the strategic vilification of countries, just in case that old Leviathan called war rears its ugly head. So, given Cuba's historical ties to Russia and China, I believe that the office of the President of the United States, and probably to a lesser degree the Department of War, want the American people to know, hey, part of the reason that Trump is designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism is because they are aligned with China and Russia, who the United States has an interest in keeping at arm's length. So we're going to continue. It says here that All right, we'll start here. It says Cuba hosts Russia's largest overseas signal intelligence facility, which tries to steal sensitive national security information of the United States. Cuba continues to build deep intelligence and defense cooperation with the PRC, that's the People's Republic of China. Cuba welcomes transnational terrorist groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, creating a safe environment for these malign groups so that these transnational terrorist groups can build economic, cultural, and security ties throughout the region and attempt to destabilize the Western Hemisphere, including the United States. Cuba has long provided defense, intelligence, and security assistance to adversaries in the Western Hemisphere, attempting to thwart the United States and international sanctions designed to enforce the stability of the region, uphold the rule of law, and safeguard the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Cuba continues to try to thwart the U.S.'s efforts to address threats to the U.S. posed by hostile countries, transnational terrorist groups, and malign actors, including the Western Hemisphere. Further, contrary to the interest and foreign policy of the United States, the Cuban communist regime supports terrorism and destabilizes the region through migration and violence. The communist regime persecutes and tortures its political opponents, denies the Cuban people free speech and press, corruptly profits from their misery, and commits other human rights violations. For example, families of political prisoners face retaliation for peacefully protesting the improper confinement of their loved ones. Cuban authorities harass worshipers, block free association by civil society organizations, prohibit free press, and deny the ability to speak freely, including on the internet. The Cuban regime continues to spread its communist ideas, policies, and practices around the Western Hemisphere, threatening the foreign policy of the United States. I think that section is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically the United States saying that the Cuban government oppresses its own people. It has created, through corruption, has created miserable conditions for the Cuban people. And that economic freedom, economic stability, and economic opportunity are very thin because there's very little in political investment in Cuban business and education. Now keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen, all right? These are the words of a president who is already skeptical on Cuba, okay? It talks about human rights violations, okay? It talks about a lot of things. It talks about the restriction of freedom of speech and of the press. That, to me, is an infraction. I think freedom of speech is a valuable resource that ensures that any government stays in line with ideas and values that are conducive to inalienable rights being respected and valued. Now, I know that different countries have different concerns with respect to freedom of speech. Me personally, I don't see any problem with it. I mean, it's a bold tradition to allow your citizens to say what they want when they want. I think the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is a true political asset to the government, the people, and the press. Now, if Cuba is restricting freedom of speech and the press, I don't think that's a good idea. Because I think the restriction of a person's voice is a way of restricting or diminishing the value of their life. So if the Cuban government is of the mindset that it wants to be that shining city on a hill in the Caribbean islands, right? that all other Caribbean islanders want to imitate, want to emulate. I think Cuba wants that. I think Cuba wants to be a standout country on the Caribbean coast. And I think it wants to do that against American interests. That I will say. I do believe that the Cuban state is against the interest and the progress of the American way of life. I do believe that. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say either that Russia and China are responsible for that. Okay? Russia and China oversaw for many decades the internal and government operations of Cuba to make sure that it was stabilizing and not destabilizing. Me personally, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not of the mindset that saying that Russia or China is the culprit here is the right thing to do. Cuba is a sovereign territory. It makes its own judgments. And even though Russia and China and North Korea have dominated Cuba sociologically, economically, militarily, and politically for 60 years now, Cuba is still a sovereign state and it makes its own sovereign decisions. I don't think it's in Cuba's best interest to vilify the United States when it has a county here in Miami-Dade County that has a 60% Cuban population, and there's also a sizable Cuban population in New York City. I don't think it's in Cuba's best interest, and I don't think it's in the best interest of Cuban Americans for the government of Cuba to continue to vilify the United States of America. I see that as backwards. I see that as a step in the wrong direction. I see that as bad diplomacy. If you have a country that has people who migrate to a foreign country and they have a 60% majority population in one of the most sought after counties anywhere in the country, you need good political relations with that country. Your people need good political relations with that country. The migrants from your country to the host country need good political relations with that country. Are Russia and China skeptical of the United States? Yeah, they're skeptical. Of course they're skeptical. They're skeptical because the three are competitors on the world stage in every aspect imaginable. So of course they're competitors, and of course the Soviets are going to side with, the communists are going to side with Cuba and other Spanish-speaking countries that have embraced communism. That's just the natural order of things. As long as there are competing political ideologies, there's going to be competition among these countries. And while there's competition among these countries, I think responsible efforts need to be made and managed in the interest of their respective societies. If you're asking me who I side with, I'm neutral. I'm neutral on this matter, just as anyone is neutral when it comes to matters of socio-political importance. I don't have a favorite country, okay? I don't have a favorite political ideology. I like a lot of things about a lot of countries, and I like a lot of things about a lot of political ideologies. There are things I like about communism, okay? I think free market capitalism is a bold approach to a meritocracy. There are also some things I like about communism. I think that communism's collectivism ensures that the most people in a country can have a maximized quality of life. Okay? So there are things I like about every country, and there are things that I like about every political philosophy. I'm neutral when it comes to that. I don't tend to favor one or the other. If I were to start my own country and call it country XYZ, I would incorporate elements of communism and capitalism into this country and call it something new. This new political philosophy. You see? So I'm a reporter, okay? I'm an editor-in-chief. I'm a journalist, okay? And I report based on objective facts that come across my desk. And right now we're doing an independent and objective analysis on Russia, because that's my job, is to be objective and subjective in my words and in my analysis of these political matters. I am a fair and balanced journalist. I am a non-biased and unbiased journalist. I am a neutral journalist. I am a journalist that analyzes facts and presents them to the world at large, the global community. So we're seeing here that Donald Trump is basically tearing Cuba down. He's saying it's communist. He's saying it's totalitarian. He's saying there's no free speech. He's saying there's human rights abuses. He's saying that the Cuban people their lives are not valued and their futures are not valued. So we're going to continue down. The United States has zero tolerance for the depredations of the Cuban communist regime. The United States will act to protect the foreign policy, national security, and national interests of the United States, including by holding the Cuban regime accountable for its malignant actions and relationships, while also remaining committed to supporting the Cuban people's aspirations for a free and democratic society. I find that the policies, practices, and actions of the government of Cuba directly threaten the safety, national security, and foreign policy of the United States. The policies, practices, and actions of the government of Cuba are designed to harm the United States and support hostile countries, transnational terrorist groups, and malign actors that seek to destroy the United States. The policies, practices, and actions of the government of Cuba are also repugnant to the moral and political values of democratic and free societies, and conflict with the foreign policy of the U.S. to encourage peaceful change in Cuba and to promote democracy, the principle of free expression in the press, the rule of law, and the respect for human rights throughout the world. Now, therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, find that the situation with respect to Cuba constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat, which has its source in whole or substantial part outside of the United States, to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, and hereby declare a national emergency with respect to the threat. To deal with the national emergency declared in this order, I determine that it is necessary and appropriate to establish a tariff system as described below. Under this system, additional ad valorem duty may be imposed on imports of goods that are products of a foreign country that directly or indirectly sells, otherwise provides any oil to Cuba. In my judgment, the tariff system as described below is necessary to appropriate to address the national security declared in this order. So we have Section 2, the imposition of tariffs, which are basically tax on imports and exports. Beginning on the effective date of this order, an additional ad valorem rate of duty may be imposed on goods imported into the United States that are products of any other country that indirectly or directly sells or otherwise provides any oil to Cuba in accordance with subsections B and C of this section. Part B says that the Secretary of Commerce I lost my place. The Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the Secretary of State and any senior official the Secretary of State deems appropriate, shall determine whether, after the effective date of this order, a foreign country directly or indirectly sells or otherwise provides any oil to Cuba. After the Secretary of Commerce finds that a foreign country directly or indirectly sells or otherwise provides any oil to Cuba, the Secretary of Commerce shall inform the Secretary of State of his finding, including any information relevant to that finding. The Secretary of Commerce may issue rules, regulations, and guidance necessary or appropriate to implement this order. The Secretary of Commerce may also make any other determinations or take any other actions necessary to or appropriate to implement this order. I'm going to read C Part 1 and then we'll examine. After the Secretary of Commerce makes an affirmative finding pursuant to the subsection B1 of this section and informs the Secretary of State of his finding, the Secretary of State, in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the United States Trade Representative, shall determine whether and to what extent an additional and ad valorem rate of duty should be imposed on goods that are products of this foreign country found to directly or indirectly sell or otherwise provide any oil to Cuba. So what we're seeing so far is we're seeing President Trump asserting that because of Cuba's constant and undeniable support for terrorist regimes, we'll say Cuba's support for regimes that the United States, particularly its Republican Party, sees as terrorists, has led Donald Trump to decide to use tariffs, that's high taxes on goods imported and exported, not only from Cuba, not only is he making it more expensive to do business with Cuba, but he's making it more expensive to do business with any country that provides oil to Cuba as well. So not only is he penalizing business with Cuba with high tariffs, but he's also penalizing business with countries that are friends with Cuba with high tariffs. That makes doing business with Cuba or any country that does business with Cuba very expensive. And American business people do not like doing expensive business with foreign countries. So it discourages American businesses from doing business with Cuba or any of the countries that Cuba is known to get oil from. So, Part 2 says that if Secretary of State determines that an ad valorem rate of duty should be imposed on goods that are products of the country found to directly or indirectly sell or otherwise provide any oil to Cuba, the Secretary of State shall inform me of his recommendation, and the Secretary of Commerce shall inform me of his finding related to that recommendation. I will then consider the recommendation and the finding, among other relevant things, and determine whether and to what extent to impose an additional ad valorem rate of duty on goods that are products of the country in question. The Secretary of State may issue rules, regulations, and guidance necessary or appropriate to implement this order. The Secretary of State may also make any other determinations or take any other actions necessary or appropriate to implement this order. Section 3 is the modification authority. To ensure that the national emergency declared in this order is dealt with, I may modify this order, including in light of additional information, recommendations from senior officials, or changed circumstances. Should a foreign country retaliate against the U.S. in response to this order or any action taken pursuant to this order, I may modify this order or actions taken pursuant to this order to ensure the efficacy of this order and the actions taken pursuant to this order to deal with the national emergency declared in this order. Should the government of Cuba or other foreign countries affected by this order take significant steps to address the national emergency declared in this order and align sufficiently with the United States on national security and foreign policy matters, I may modify this order. So Section 3 is just basically saying that that the president, the sitting U.S. president, has the capacity and the authority under the Constitution to modify this document, this statement, which is really a national security and national emergency order. He's basically declaring that Cuba's activities have alarmed the military and intelligence communities of the United States to the point where a national emergency needs to be declared about Cuba and its terroristic threat to the United States. I imagine particularly the narco-terroristic threat that Cuba poses to the United States. I'm not going to sit here and say that just because they are friends with North Korea, China, and Russia, that makes Cuba a terrorist, a state sponsor of terrorism. I think that Cuba's support of narco-terrorist groups throughout Central, South America, and the Caribbean is what makes it a terrorist problem. And this order, this national security writ, can be modified by the president. And he's essentially saying that if this order is attacked, that the integrity of this order will be upheld militarily. And also it's saying that if Cuba or another foreign country were to change their ways, that this order might be modified. So Section 4 is monitoring and recommendations. The Secretary of State, in consultation with any senior official of the Secretary of State deems appropriate, shall monitor the circumstances involving the national security declared in this order. The Secretary of State shall inform me of any circumstance that, in his opinion, which might indicate the need for further presidential action to deal with the national emergency declared in this order. The Secretary of State, in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the United States Trade Representative, and any other senior official that the Secretary of State deems appropriate, shall recommend me to additional action if necessary. If the actions in this order or taken pursuant to this order are not effective in dealing with the national emergency declared in this order, the Secretary of Commerce shall monitor whether a foreign country directly or indirectly sells or otherwise provides any oil to Cuba. The Secretary of Commerce shall continue such a monitoring after a foreign country has been found to do so. So we see basically in Section 4 where the President has designated the Secretary of State to essentially have oversight over the implementation of this order concerning Cuba. And the Secretary of State has been charged by the President of the United States to share with him any circumstance that might indicate the need for further presidential action on this order. So the Secretary of State is basically a watchdog for this order, or rather a corporate monitor for this order. And if anything concerning this order arises and could be of importance to the executive office of the President of the United States, what it's saying is that that Secretary of State is to contact the President of the United States and let him know what about this order has concerned him or alarmed him, or what it is about this order that has caused an area of uncertainty. So that's essentially what is being outlined here are the duties of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the United States Trade Representatives, okay, all have a role in monitoring this order that is coming from the Executive Office of the President of the United States with respect to how foreign persons and domestic persons, foreign entities and domestic entities have reacted to this order. And if they detect a reaction of any general concern to them concerning how people or entities are reacting to this order, then the President of the United States is to be notified of the concerns that are present. And once he is notified, then he will be able to modify and or take appropriate action on the intelligence that has been given to him. So Part C, it reads that the Secretary of Commerce shall monitor whether a foreign country directly or indirectly sells or otherwise provides any oil to Cuba. The Secretary of Commerce shall continue monitoring after a foreign country has been found to do so. So this is the Office of the President assigning that responsibility to the Secretary of Commerce, monitoring whether a foreign country directly or indirectly sells or otherwise provides oil to Cuba. And the reason that's of importance to the President of the United States is because the President is going to impose tariffs on those countries, okay, to make it more difficult for American business people to do business with those countries because they have chosen to sell oil to Cuba. That's the basis of the tariffs that President Trump is talking about in this order. So in Section 5 in delegation, it says, consistent with applicable law, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce are directed and authorized to take all actions necessary to implement and effectuate this order, including through temporary suspension or amendment of regulations through notices in the Federal Register and by adopting rules, regulations, or guidance, and to employ all powers granted to the President, including by the IEEPA, as may be necessary to implement in this order. The head of each executive department and agency is authorized to and shall take all appropriate measures within the agency's authority to implement this order. The head of each agency may, consistent with applicable law, including Section 301 of Title III of the United States Code, redelegate the authority to take such appropriate measures within the agency. So, ladies and gentlemen, what you're going to hear in this, what you're going to recognize in Section 5 is you're going to see where the Office of the President of the United States has charged the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce to take all actions necessary to implement the edicts that are presented in this presidential order. So essentially what President Trump is doing here is he's basically delegating authority to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce so that they can act on his behalf with respect to making sure that this order is properly implemented. And you see something here about the IEEPA. So the IEEPA is an acronym for the I'm sorry, I just had it here. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This was a bill that was passed in 1977 that allows the U.S. president to declare a national emergency and restrict trade or freeze assets in response to an unusual and extraordinary threat from foreign sources. It was recently deemed insufficient to authorize tariffs, but the president is not relying solely on the IEEPA to authorize tariffs. It's citing Cuba's history with sponsoring terroristic networks and so forth as having been relayed to him by the CIA and the Department of Defense. So what you can do, ladies and gentlemen, is compare this recording right here that I'm making today. Compare this recording to my previous to my previous recordings on presidential concerns with Caribbean affairs. Okay? You'll see similar orders having been passed. You'll see similar statements being made by different presidents going all the way back to Ronald Reagan. And there's a wealth of information to be read. There's a wealth of information to be absorbed there. And there's a wealth of information to be understood there. And there's a wealth of information to be unpacked there. So Section 6 is about reporting directives. The Secretary of State, in consultation with any senior official that he deems appropriate, is hereby authorized and directed to submit recurring and final reports to the Congress on the national emergency declared in and authorities exercised by this order consistent with Section 401 of the NEA and Section 204C of the IEEPA. So apparently the reporting directives are delegated to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State is allowed to consult with any senior official he thinks necessary to ensure that the national emergency declarations in this report are consistent with the appropriate articles and sections of federal documents. So Section 7, we see the definitions. For the purposes of this order, the term oil means crude oil or petroleum products. The term indirectly includes selling to or otherwise providing oil to Cuba through intermediaries or third countries, with knowledge that such oil may be provided to Cuba as determined by the Secretary of Commerce. The term Cuba means the territory of Cuba and any other territory or marine area, including the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf over which the government of Cuba claims sovereignty, sovereign rights or jurisdiction, provided that the government of Cuba exercises partial or total de facto control over the area or derives a benefit from economic activity in the area pursuant to international arrangements. The term government of Cuba includes the government of Cuba and any political subdivision, agency, or instrumentality thereof, and any person owned or controlled by or acting on or behalf of the government of Cuba. So what we see in definitions, we just basically see legal definitions as to some of the terms that are used in this order. Section 8, the effective date. This order is effective at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 30th of 2026. Section 9, interaction with other presidential actions. Any provision of previous proclamations and executive orders that is inconsistent with the actions directed in this order is superseded to the extent of such inconsistency. Severability, if any provision of this order of the application thereof to any individual or circumstance is held to be invalid, the remainder of this order and the application of its provisions to any other individuals and circumstance shall not be affected. If the actions in this order or any action pursuant to this order is held invalid, the other actions imposed to deal with the national emergencies declared with respect to the government of Cuba shall not be affected and shall remain in effect. So basically 8, 9, and 10, sections 8, 9, and 10 are talking about the effective date, which is 12:01. It's just a stroke past midnight Eastern Standard Time on January 30th, 2026. That's when this emergency order goes into effect. Basically, this order overrides other presidential orders that may conflict with it. This order is considered legal and valid, and if later on through a judicial process any part of this order are seen as unconstitutional and those parts of the order are stricken down, it's saying that the other parts of the order that are seen as perfectly constitutional will remain intact, and that one part of the order being stricken down judicially, presumably by the Supreme Court, that's the only court I could think of that could reverse the actions present in a national emergency order signed by the president. So essentially, if the Supreme Court were to find inconsistencies or unconstitutional aspects of this order and were to strike them down or make them unconstitutional and null and void, that the rest of the document still stands. So Section 11, we have general provisions. Nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect the authority granted by law to an executive department or agency or the head thereof, or the functions of the director of the Office of Management and Budget related to budgetary, administrative, or legislative proposals. This order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations. This order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States, its departments, agencies, or entities, its officers, employees, or agents, or any other person. The cost of this publication of this order shall be borne by the Department of State. Signed, Donald J. Trump, the White House, January 29th, 2026. So what we see in Section 11 is we see that there is a general oversight with respect to the structuring of this letter. It is not meant to impair, hinder, impede upon, construct, or make difficult the jobs of the Office of Management or Budget or any government auxiliary, any department, agency, or entity, officers of the government, employees, or agents. It's meant to get a grasp on the situation with Cuba and not to hinder or impede upon the rights of other countries. Now, I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to make this part A of this lecture, and I will be back with a part B, and if need be, a part C. And thank you for listening. We will close this portion of the lecture there. This was basically a national security order, a national emergency order that was issued by President Trump in January of this year concerning the Cuban state. He's essentially giving his reasons for designating it a state sponsor of terrorism and why he believes that Cuba is a threat to national security in the United States. Furthermore, he gives an outline as to the actions that he's prepared to take in response to this skepticism of Cuba, which includes tariffs on imports and exports, that's to and from Cuba. Also, tariffs on imports and exports to any country that provides oil to Cuba. So he's essentially manipulating the use of tariffs to fortify his adversarial stance towards Cuba's government. And also there were delegations as to who upholds and sustains this order, namely the Secretary of State. And he also gets into a number of other things as well. I encourage you to re-listen to this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, to grab the full scope of the narrative, and also read the documents on this, the lecture notes that I've posted on Facebook concerning this document, so you can read them for yourself also. I will be back with another lecture at some point in the near future. Thank you for tuning in.